thanks for the invitation to speak today. Look, we're going to go through a little bit. The topic is around supplementary feeding in dry times and some information there around the health aspects as well. We will touch on that, but I think probably what is also important in years like this, and also looking forward to next year, is just to touch briefly on the feed budgeting and how that links into, I guess, forward planning and also managing health and condition of stock as well. We'll talk a little bit around, when we get into these feed deficit situations, what are the options around, adjusting, selling and feeding stock, which will then take us into the supplementary feeding topics and discussing some of the health and management aspects that come with that as well. But initially, look, I think one of the really important things that I've seen, I guess, working with clients this year has been more important than ever is actually working through what is the strategy for your livestock enterprise in the first place. And a lot of this relates back to actually having some really clear production goals for your sheep enterprise. And that might be anything around, target marking percentages. Rachel put up some numbers there around, what some of those people were targeting for things like lamb survival. It might be labour efficiency. You might have some targets for the people in the business around, how you're actually going to manage, workload and holidays and all those aspects as well. But I think particularly, even when we're looking at these types of seasons, having some really clear key business targets is pretty important in terms of working through how you actually manage the livestock enterprise, and particularly when we're investing a lot of money potentially into feed and the costs that are being outlaid, having the production goals allows you to sleep better at night when you can work back and determine is the cost benefit there for the decisions that we're making at this point in time. Often I think in these sorts of years, I see a lot of the time we get the calls from clients who haven't necessarily got really good business targets coming in thick and fast in these years about, we've got to buy another semi-load of grain. Is it worth it? Or can we stop yet? And when we don't have those production goals out the other side, it's really hard to answer that sort of question. But when you know that it's going to be justified because you're going to pick up 10 or 15% extra lambing, then you can actually work back and say, yes, we can justify it from this point forward, or no, we've got to make some new decisions and reassess. So it is really important to have those targets. And clearly, if we've got goals and targets for the enterprise, having a plan about how we're going to get there is a really important part of that. So I think looking at that, look, this season, you all know roughly where we're at in terms of production and the issues that are being, I guess, dealt with in terms of this dry season. This is pastures from space data for the last 15 years, looking at basically feed growth over the course of the year. Each different coloured line represents a different year. And just so you can make it out, that's this year. Right, now you know that, you've seen that out in the paddock, but it is interesting to put that in context of the other years and see, okay, exactly where are we currently sitting relative to other years. Now, with a couple of warm days that we've had this week, we're pretty well done for growing season, aren't we? Okay, and normally we'd be looking to try and get to this sort of mid-October, late October period before we get there. Whereas now we've been done since virtually middle of September. So this is just giving us the information to say, right, we need to be proactive in how we're going to manage this situation from this point forward, because we've got a long time to go until potentially we start to get some new green feed after the break of the next season. Now we've got till probably June, July to deal with. So we've got some time here that we need to start thinking about managing. And that directly relates to sheep health, and the supplementary feeding strategies that we need to be thinking about. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going through how to do feed budgets. That's a topic in itself. But basically, when we're going through feed budgeting, we're working through a scenario of how much feed have we got available on the place right now, how much are we likely to grow between now and whatever point we're trying to budget towards. So that might be a 3-month budget, might be a 6 or a 9 or a 12-month budget. And how much feed are we consuming? What classes of stock have we got on the place? When are we likely to sell some? Going through that process allows you to work out when are we actually going to be needing to take stock off paddocks, when are our critical thresholds to be either putting stock maybe into containment or more heavily supplementary feeding. The process is about being proactive in this management. And I'm putting the note up there, it's not just for dry seasons. It is important to think about, it should be something that should be on the radar most years. And particularly for us here where we've got a very seasonal rainfall pattern, even when you go back to this information, pretty well by November, our spring growth is done. Right? We haven't got much coming through here until really we start to get back in a little bit of a kick at the autumn break, but then really it's this big spring flush that we're dealing with. Okay, we're not in an area where we tend to get lots of summer rain and lots of summer growth that we can start to budget on as well. We've got a really clear area that we can work with in terms of feed budgeting to make that accurate. So it's about understanding exactly how much feed we need to have in stock, and that might be in the paddock, might be in the shed, or it might be making decisions about potentially, who's sold. There's lots of tools available online to help you through that process. It is basically a big number crunching exercise, and it's not simple to do in some respects, and I think that's one of the reasons why we don't do enough of it. It is a lot of work to them sometimes to get them right, but just be aware there's plenty of tools available online to help work through that process. This is one that Evergraze do. MLA have a feed budget or a feed demand calculator online. Just either get in touch with people that can put you in access with some of these, but there's plenty of opportunities to do them. The outputs from these vary in what they look like, but this might be just one example of what you might get out of it. And this is, if you put in a budget, this is just one that we put up for going from October through. And in this scenario, we said, righto, we've got very little growth coming through the rest of the summer, and you can see, right, we're starting with about 1,500 kilos of feed in the paddocks per hectare, and each month we're just declining. Now, in many situations here, if you're running a mixed enterprise, you might have some stubble grazing that pushes that out a little bit. You might have some months grazing that'll buy you some time in the paddocks. But if you know that in general you're trying to conserve at least a tonne of ground cover, a tonne of feed out in the paddocks, instantly you can start to put some timelines around when that is going to kick in. In this scenario here that we come up with, right, 1st of March, we're done. 1st of April, we're starting to push the paddocks down to 800 kilos, and even less, you're far lower again. So you can start to see when we need to pull the budgets in. So once you know that, you can play around with the scenarios of how do we manage it? Do we feed through it? Do we sell? Do we seek agistment? All those options come up. We won't touch on agistment today, that's not the purpose of it. Selling I will only just touch on briefly, in that certainly this year it's been a key time to be thinking about obviously getting rid of anything that's dry. Earlier in the year, pregnancy scanning, anything that's dry was potentially a saleable animal. And even now, for the last month, or for those of you later lambing, anything that's dry at marking time or weaning time is another key animal that you'd be thinking about offloading. This is a good year to put some pressure on the situation, some pressure on the flock, and try and improve that aspect of it. The other thing to think about is, what are we doing with saleable stock, with young stock? Okay, it doesn't pay to maintain anything that you're trying to sell down the line. Okay, you're only incurring cost in terms of maintenance of that animal. So whether you're feeding it to finish it, or you're looking at selling it. That decision is purely a budgetary one. What's it worth now? What can you sell it for? What's the margin that you're going to make? And in some ways, you need to have a bit of an understanding as to what your cost of production is to that point. How much does it cost you to get your lambs to weaning? Are you going to make enough margin on them now to justify it, or do you hang on to them and finish them a little bit, whether it's your own feedlot, contract feed them, whatever the situation is? That can be purely a budgetary decision in a lot of respects. The other thing is, if you need to keep digging into numbers, then it's, right, what do we do with breeding stock? So if you're looking at having to offload some breeding stock, classically we look at age groups. Do we get rid of just one of the oldest age groups? Do we maybe take some of the younger ones out? But one of the other things we need to be thinking about more and more is, what is the productivity of those animals within the flock, rather than necessarily just their age. And can we actually identify some of the lower productive animals in the group, in the whole flock, and cull those out selectively? Okay, we know that there is a big range in the productivity of animals, and certainly there's a lot more information coming out in this area over the last few years. But even looking at this study, this was 2016 figures looking at the bottom quarter and the top quarter of animals within a flock. And we knew from the top quarter of these animals, so the top performers generated nearly $1,000 in income over their lifetime. This is 2016 figures, so you can imagine it's a little bit higher again now. Reared on average 5.6 lambs, cut a little bit less wool, right? Because generally they're rearing more lambs, wool cut's going to be down a little bit, and they generally appear thinner. And that's one of the things we need to be careful of when we're actually selecting animals in years like this, is that we don't always just take out the lightest, thinnest ones, because they may well be some of your more productive ones. Okay, you see the extreme end of the really big fat ones that haven't reared anything, and you can find them, but just be a bit careful in that middle ground. At the bottom end, the bottom ewes on average, so this by far isn't just the worst animal in the group, this is the bottom quarter, reared about half the income, $500. Only reared 1.2 lambs, cut a little bit more wool, certainly generally looked fatter because 70% of them were dry, and contributed to nearly half the total lamb mortality. So identifying those sorts of differences, in the longer term, I think as we start to look at things like EID more, will allow us to be a lot more selective about the animals that stay in the flock. Okay, not only is that a profit decision, but it's a health decision for these animals too. Being able to identify the animals that can tolerate the system that you're running and perform well and maintain a good condition score and good level of health. So the next situation is what are we doing about feeding? And we'll just touch a little bit, I guess, on the supplementary feeding side and how that links in potentially with grazing some crops, potentially also with some containment areas. But I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual how, it's the who and how do we manage the whole situation. And one of the things to be thinking about this year, if you're not at it already, is early weaning. Okay, that's been a big part of the game this season already for many places, and that's been a strategy to try and better allocate the feed resources that we have. Okay, early weaning, and by this we're talking about, say, in lambs, anything from sort of 10 to 12 weeks on average age is more than comfortable to be weaned from a production point of view. Down to 8 weeks of age is generally okay. By 8 weeks of age, lambs have developed their rumens. Okay, so that's the absolute minimum age that we want to try and take them off. But at an average, if you've got the flock to that 10 to 12 week age, they're quite comfortable from an age point of view to be weaned. Then you start to think about what happens with weight gain and the body weight of the animals. The biggest driver of early weaning should be what growth rate can you achieve in those animals if you wean them off. If you can put weight on them by weaning them, the age and the weight that they're at matters less. If you wean them light and you wean them young and they don't gain any weight, that's where the big problems arise. So can you actually wean those animals early? Do you have good quality feed that you can put them onto, whether it's an allocated pasture or whether it's good quality supplementary feed that you can utilise? That will actually be a really good strategy in terms of better utilising the feed that you've got available to those animals. Because at that point, and hopefully now, you've got some time to get those ewes back up in condition. And if you wean and separate the two, it gives you a better opportunity to better allocate the nutrient resources that you've got and actually allocate the higher quality feed to the lambs and actually manage the nutrition of the ewes spot on as well. For ewes leading up to next year, condition score in terms of how we manage them between now and next joining is really important. So just do a draft on fats and thins. It can be as simple as that. Split those thins off and give them the opportunity to catch up in condition-wise, because as we talked about before, they may well be some of your highest productive animals. So we don't want to disadvantage them. One of the other things is, how do we actually manage replacement stock coming through? Sometimes in these sorts of seasons, what we see is the young hoggets really battle to actually join up well next year because we haven't achieved the growth rates to get them up to good joining weights and to get good conception rates next year. So know where they're at weight-wise now, know what sort of target weight they have to be joined at, and work back as to what the growth rate required is. And that'll give you a bit good guide as to how much nutrition you need to throw at them. And equally, it'll give you a bit of a guide as to what's worth throwing at them. And it might be that it's better to push them quicker now and let them back off than to try and just let them sit now and have to push later when the feed quality's declined and it's going to cost you more to do it. Sales stock we've talked about in terms of making the decision around selling or finishing yourself, and that's just a cost side of things. One of the other ones that comes up, I guess, a lot in these sorts of seasons, and particularly relating to health as well, is to what level do you feed? And what level do you feed breeding stock? So production-wise. Is it better to actually just maintain those animals and they might be held at a score 2, 2.5, or do you keep pushing and do you have your ewes in score 3 and still achieve really good conception rates and good lambing rates? One of the things to be really conscious of is the cost of maintenance of these animals. When you look at energy and you take the energy requirements of, say, a twin-bearing ewe, 2/3 of the energy that she eats every year goes straight to maintenance. So very little in respect to the whole course of the year actually goes towards production in terms of generating 2 lambs. So if you've incurred the cost of all that energy already, to my mind, you might as well push that a little bit further and get some good levels of production. Because it's an overhead cost to your business. And like any overhead in a business, you want to spread it out over as much production as you possibly can. So breeding to production or feeding to production may well still pay in these sorts of seasons. And a lot of the scenarios where we've run the budgets, it can still work. If you're only going to feed to maintenance and accept really low levels of production, you nearly might as well start to just offload more and achieve a high level of production out of the fewer animals that you've got. So be really careful about how you do those budgets in these sorts of seasons, because it's a very different scenario with the market value for sheep, the market value for wool, and equally the market value for feed as well. So compared to dry seasons, droughts have passed, we're in a very different stage. One of the other things to be thinking about here is when we're looking at condition score of breeding stock, is once we've got animals to our target condition score, it's far easier to hold them there than to let them go down and then try and pick them up again. And if we can do that, then we can still potentially achieve good levels of condition for joining. So in ewes, we know as their condition score goes up, the percentage of dries is reduced, so the percentage that fall pregnant is higher. We know that the higher the condition score of those animals, the more twins they're going to have. And equally, I know we've got a bit of a focus on sheep today, but cattle, it's the same sort of thing. There's a few people with cattle in the room. We know that with better condition, not only do those cows will come, their days back to calving is reduced as well, and particularly if they're on better quality feed. Especially when we're talking about twins, and this is going to have effect later in next year, but there's very strong relationships between condition score and lamb survival in twins, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen this type of information before, but it's important to keep in mind because it gives you a clear guidance as to who we should be allocating feed resources to as well. In a season like this, when you've got singles that can basically achieve 85 to 90% lamb survival, even down to sort of score 2, you know that you should be throwing a lot more resources at the twins. Because those ewes, if they start to fall down to score 2, might be achieving 50, 60% lamb survival. So when you know what the requirements are, you know the effects of nutrition on condition score and the effects of those condition scores on production, you can start to really allocate the nutrition that you've got properly. And that's got big effects in terms of not only production and profit, but obviously the animal health side of things too. We're not going to go through a lot in terms of ration formulation today. That's same with feed budgeting, a topic in itself, but be aware that there are some good tools available that you can use to give some guidance on that. So in terms of ration side of things, look, the New South Wales DPI drought feed calculator is pretty good in terms of being able to put in a number of feed resources, bring up some requirements for stock, doing some mixes and justifying those mixes. Graz feed for some people works quite well. The lamb feedlot calculator's got some, and that's a DPI and CRC product as well. That's got some ration formulation parts to it, but also has importantly some budgets and the cost benefit side of things with lamb feedlotting. So if you're making those decisions about whether you finish lambs or sell them, that can be a useful tool. And equally, the Lifetime U app can put some information in there around, how much energy are ewes requiring, what are some of the feeds that would be able to supply that. So for those of you that have done Lifetime U, you'd be well aware of that and how to use those. But those resources are available. So I guess the question is where we're at now, but we've also got to be thinking about where we're going to get to next season. How do we protect paddocks? How do we protect ground cover? How do we manage stock for quite a little while yet? And I think one of the things that is important in that is understanding how long it might take for us to generate enough feed next season when we do get some rainfall, or even if we're achieving some level of pasture growth rate now. And next season, if you think about the fact that, let's say we take our paddocks down to our minimum ground cover targets now, and next season we want to be growing another 500 or 1,000 kilos of feed before we start putting heavy stocking rates on paddocks, we need to think about how long that is going to take and how does that affect our grazing management between now and then. And that's clearly driven by what pasture growth rates are like. Now, I'll just flick back to this one here. Pastures from space, look, I don't 100% rely on the actual raw numbers in terms of the pasture growth rate. The trends are brilliant, but the actual numbers take with a grain of salt. But you can start to see that, quite often through this sort of autumn flush period, we're dealing with anything from sort of 10 to 20 kilos per hectare per day pasture growth. Throughout winter, things like our native pastures are struggling to do 4 or 5 kilos. But we come into spring and really rapidly growing pastures or crops can be comfortably doing 50, 60, even 100 at times. From the break to when we have sufficient feed in the paddock, it's at least a month. Can we see that? If we have pastures growing slowly and we actually want to try and achieve a little bit more pasture growth in the paddock, you might be up to 2 months' time. So being aware of how much time and lag time we've got from actually achieving a break to when we've got sufficient feed to actually be stocking it is part of that feed budgeting process. So one of the other things to be thinking about this season is how do we conserve some extra paddock feed for grazing next year? And that might be looking at grazing some crop options. So doing some budgets around, right, are we going to harvest paddocks, are we going to graze them, is going on flat out at the moment, right? Everyone's doing a lot of that. So it is something to be thinking about. It's something that you can potentially either utilise these crops now. It may be an opportunity in terms of grazing some crops later in the season as well. In terms of general management, happy to chat in more detail over a break or something, but typically, in terms of utilisation, we're still trying to target high stocking rates in these situations, which then naturally tends to lead to issues with water availability. If you're going to stock the numbers, if you're going to put in temporary fencing, you've got to have water availability. So think about how you can potentially either split the paddock up to still provide sufficient water access, or whether you've got some portable water systems that can come into play. At this time of the year onwards, look, there's not enough water out there typically to actually get away without not putting any water out there. Earlier in the season, sometimes you can achieve it that way, but from now on, we won't be at that point. The other thing to think about is when you use them, and do you let it go to grain fill or not? So certainly when we're looking at, grazing oats, for an example, would often be an opportunity just to let it go through. And it might be that you graze some of your pastures more now, take them down to where you want them to, and then graze the oats later in the season once you've got some grain fill. And that provides some quality because you've got the grain in the head there. Most cereals at the moment are virtually at their lowest quality point. You think when we normally cut things for hay, it's typically just about at its worst quality. Right, for cereals, we're down at, pick your number, 8, 9 ME, might be 8% protein. As you start to allow it to ripen and you get some grain in the head, yes, the quality of the stem and even the leaf has declined a bit, but the grain in the head pulls your overall value up a little bit. So you might think about whether you can let it go through to grain fill, and there's agronomic decisions that come into that. How do you manage weeds? All those things are part of that decision-making process. But these can all come into play in varying ways in your grazing system. Containment has been utilised a lot this year already, I think, and probably will get utilised a lot next year too. It is certainly something that gets used in dry seasons, but it is also something that is probably getting used more strategically in many farms now, every 2 to 3 years quite comfortably. And it's a way that can potentially allow you to increase the carrying capacity of the farm overall. If you have very seasonal growth patterns, sometimes short periods of containment, if it's done right and at the right time, can allow you to run just a few more stock safely and just utilise your feed that you've got available to you better. Certainly this year, these types of areas will allow you to have some sort of a feedlot option as well. The design of them are virtually no different. Okay, so the design criteria of something like a containment area and a feedlot are basically exactly the same. We go for time, 23. There's plenty of resources available on how to set these areas up. NRM, Adelaide Mountain Lofty, has got a containment area fact sheet out. There's plenty online if you Google containment areas or drought lots, and you'll find some resources there. But in principle, the key things to be thinking about is certainly trying to separate things like your feed area from your water area. Have your feed area at the top end of the slope, so you're not having stock down in the wet end if you do get some rain. And from the welfare point of view, it was interesting. We had the information earlier about the sheds, right, and providing shelter. And certainly from a containment area point of view, and even from a feedlot point of view, shade and shelter are really critical. So they're an important part of this. As a rough guide, allow yourself at least 5 metres squared per head. Okay, and more doesn't generally hurt. Okay, going to 10 metres squared is not going to change anything. It will actually generally provide a small benefit. Going to 50 or 100 metres squared, sure, that's where it changes things. If you've got so much area that as soon as you get a little bit of rain, you're getting green feed coming through, sure, gone too far. But when we start looking at the area per head, lots of people get caught up on whether they're giving them 4 metres or 5 metres squared or 6 metres squared. It's the last thing to be arguing about. Okay, and a little bit of extra room is useful. Typically when we're setting these things up, the pitfalls that we commonly see is something like site selection. Right, so not having enough slope on the area or having no slope. Location of feed and watering. One of the other things to be thinking about is how do you manage nutrition in containment when you're using predominantly a cereal diet? Right, so normally we're going to have something like a cereal hay or straw ad lib, and you might have a barley or an oats or even a wheat ration in there. calcium deficiency is the big thing we've got to deal with in that situation. So make sure that we've got sufficient calcium in the diet. We'll talk about induction into these areas in a minute, but this is, sometimes there's photos that have got good parts and not so good parts. What's wrong with the slope in this site? Straight down, right? So the bottom one's copping it. Yeah, so should have spun it around the other way. And certainly, things like, where do we place things like feeders? Now, there's some differences going on here, and in some situations, people will feed out in laneways separately, if they're putting the grain out here. Water troughs are right in the middle, right? So ideally, I like to see them either at one end, preferably the lower end of the slope, so when you're cleaning out, the water's actually getting out of the pens as well, and you're not creating wet patches, which particularly if you're containing ewes that are in late pregnancy, can be an issue for mastitis, right? We don't want big, wet, muddy patches throughout the pens. The big thing with exiting containment is how do you make that transition in nutrition really smooth, right? Sometimes we lose a lot more ewes coming out of containment than we ever did coming in. So think about, can you make that transition as smooth as possible? And that will help from a health point of view, and it'll also help from a wool quality point of view. Okay, if you have a big change in nutrition, you're going to change micron, you're going to produce breaks in the wool. So make sure that we can actually make that transition nice and smooth. So it's about not letting them out hungry, filling them up on hay, potentially providing some of your ration out in the paddock wherever they're going to. So there's some tips and tricks around that. Inducting into these types of systems is pretty important. Make sure that wherever possible, we try and manage them in groups. And that might be based on preg status, it might be based on fats and thins condition score. Once again, we want to look after these thin animals if possible. Provided they're productive in our system, we want to bring them back up again. Health-wise, vaccinations are absolutely critical, not only just in containment, but when we're heavily supplementary feeding, and especially with grain, we want to be really aware of pulpy kidney. That's our big problem that'll normally come up in these types of seasons with heavy supplementary feeding. So something like just a 3-in-1 will cover that. And typically, if you're heavily grain feeding, you want to be doing that every 3 months. Coming in or onto grain feeding, particularly in containment, we'll look at providing some good quality hay for the first 5 to 7 days. So we've got good fibrous feed in there, helps with rumen function, helps with that change over to grain, and then we can start to transition to straw if that's the end game or not. Introduction to grain is something that we need to talk about, and it's relative to a few things. One is, what is the grain type? Okay, so in terms of managing acidosis and how rapidly we can get them onto that grain, we need to think about how much starch content there is to it. So typically with something like oats, with a relatively low starch content, we can get them onto it quickly. If we're talking about barley or wheat, we're generally going to take 2 to 3 weeks to build them up to full feeding levels. So some of it depends on what level of feeding you want to get to. Right? If you're feeding 300 or 400 grams a day, you'll get them there fairly quickly. If you're trying to feed them a kilo a day, it's going to take you longer. So often with something like barley or wheat, we'll only feed in 50 gram increments. Right, so we'll start at 50 grams per head, we'll build by 50 grams per head thereafter, each feed thereafter. So you can start to see why it often takes a couple of weeks to get them onto full rations. Buffers can certainly help, as can sort of the rumen modifiers, so things like your Rumensin or Bovatec. Buffers wise, things like acid buffer are working really quite well in terms of helping to get stock onto these products, onto grain. They will not cover you 100%, right? You still have to take it gradually. And even when you're just supplementary in terms of trail feeding out in the paddock, you need to be really gradual in getting them onto grain if they haven't seen it for a while as well. Be aware that often, if stock haven't had access to grain for 48 hours, you're virtually back to square one in terms of rumen adaptation onto that grain. Now that doesn't mean if you're trail feeding every 2 days, they're going back to nothing, because usually they're still cleaning up some of the grain from when you're out there last. But if they haven't had any grain for a couple of days, you've almost got to start them back from the start again. Making sure that you've got plenty of access to either the trail that you're putting out or self or lick feeders is really important, and it's particularly important in terms of managing any shy feeders. One of the big reasons that we get shy feeders in any sort of intensive system is because they don't have enough access to feed, and you get too much dominance going on within the group. If you have lots of access to feed, you should have virtually no shy feeders coming through, and you get the introduction right. Vaccinations, once again, really important. Mineral and vitamin supplements are an interesting one, and certainly, with any of these sorts of heavy supplementary feeding rations, calcium's a really important part, so making sure we've got some lime in the diet is important. Trace minerals may well be something to look at, but it depends on what's been going on the farm. If they've only just come off, let's say they're coming into containment and you know that you haven't got any severe mineral deficiencies on the property, there's no need to go hard with trace minerals straight away from day one. Right, if they've been on a ration, supplementary feeding ration for months and months, and it's just something like a cereal, hay and a barley, sure, you put some trace minerals in and deal with those. Things like magnesium are still really important to supplement with in these situations as well. Helps a lot with the stress, helps a lot with stress with handling, and particularly at things like weaning time, it might be a well worthwhile product to use as well. Vitamin A and E will certainly be one thing we need to be conscious of, when we have prolonged periods of dry times. A little bit of grain feed certainly corrects that relatively quickly, but certainly if we're having, an extended dry period from now on, where stock are going to be on dry feed for months and months and months, then vitamin A and E would be worthwhile in terms of supplementing. A couple of minutes.
How soon would you recommend that they get A and E after you got onto your dry feed?
Generally, they've got enough coverage for about 3 months. So from grain feed, they've got good coverage for about 3 months. It's interesting, E's normally the first one to drop out or at least cause production effects anyway. Vitamin A is one, there's been some good research that was actually done looking at the effect of vitamin A deficiency on lambs, and supplementing deficient ewes in late pregnancy with A did very little effect, but supplementing the lambs once they were born was highly effective. So the timing of when the deficiency is and production is an important part of it. But yeah, generally 2 to 3 months is pretty comfortable for that dry period. If it was going to extend beyond that, you'd be looking at providing some supplementation. Yeah. So I think just in summary, from today, make sure that we've got a really clear production goal. And I think that relates a lot to actually having some good outcomes and being able to allow you to sleep at night in terms of the level of feeding that might be going on and the cost that's involved at the moment. So make sure you've worked through, and that spreadsheet I think one of your clients had up there with all the years and their conception rates, marking rates, rainfall, all those is actually a really useful piece of information for you to have on hand and to collect each year, because it allows you to know where you're at the moment, where you're trying to target to, and start to work through the strategies that will get you there, and how supplementary feeding fits into that is an important point. Look at how you manage stock, look at the passengers that you might be able to remove to lessen the feeding load. Make sure that you manage nutrition as cost effectively as possible, so some of those tools we looked at can be useful. And one other point is just making sure that when you're comparing potential supplementary feeding options, consider what the cost is per unit of energy or per unit of protein. So look at what you're trying to chase, and it's not always just the cost per tonne, but think about how many units of energy are in there, how many units of protein, what's the most cost-effective feed potentially landed on farm. There will be probably a use for holding paddocks / containment areas coming up next year, okay, if there hasn't been already. So think about how you can potentially utilise those areas to make sure that we manage ground cover, to make sure that we actually manage the regeneration of feed as quickly as possible next year as well. And from an animal health point of view, things like acidosis, we've certainly got to manage with heavy grain feeding. Pulpy kidney is our big one to make sure we're watching as well. If you see any animals that just are alive one day, dead the next, you should instantly be thinking pulpy kidney. That's one that I think we don't recognise often enough and we put down to other diseases. And certainly, in years like this with a lot of supplementary feeding, some of the vitamin and mineral supplements may well come into play as well. So I think there's a few resources there. We'll circulate this, and I think being recorded anyway, you'll be able to look up some of this, but we'll circulate a link to some of these resources if you want to look at a few more online. But make sure you have a chat with anyone that can give you extra information on this if you want. And yeah, happy to take a couple of questions if you've got a moment. Nanny.
Hamish, have you, a couple of years ago, I think I was a nut job for asking this question, but have you ever fed or had experience in feeding lentils to sheep? And how much starch is in them?
We've been feeding probably a reasonable amount of lentils. I don't know starch content off the top of my head, but there's been a fair bit of lentils fed in the last 12 months, and it's been going fine. There's no major issue with lentils in terms of any nutritional factors. There was murmurings of that, but a lot of that's been bred out. It's similar to what we found in vetch. It's not so much of an issue now. So no, it's quite fine to use. It's just another protein source. Consider it like your beans and lupins and peas. From a safety point of view, we could do some digging and see if we can find the starch content. I don't know whether, Shup, have you got starch content of lentils off the top of your head? No. We haven't had any major acidosis issues with it to suggest it's really high and causing a problem. And yeah, quality-wise, it's fine. I thought you were going to say lentil hay, because I heard someone the other day rang up and said, "Oh, you got any tests on lentil hay?" I said, "No." Nah. But it's going to be in play this year. Hey?
Do you think it'd be good or bad?
I think it should be good. Yeah. Quantity will be your problem. Yeah. Yeah.
What about canola hay? Is that more a cattle feeding sheep?
No, not necessarily, but it very much depends on when it's cut. So that's the problem with canola hays. It can be amazing quality, and we're just starting to get a few canola hay tests rolling in now from clearly stuff that was cut just before this last group that's been dropped down now. We had a canola test that came in yesterday. It was 11.8 ME, 17.4% protein. NDF was 28. Like you'd almost look at it and go, it's a feedlot ration. The problem with canola hay is if you go too late, it just turns into stalk and it's absolute rubbish. So it can go one way or the other, and it's a little unpredictable. If it's cut under a lot of moisture stress, then you need to be conscious of whether nitrates can be a problem in it as well. But we're not seeing too much of that this year. But yeah, when you see a few crops that have been dropped under severe moisture stress, sometimes that can be a problem, and we've seen a few stock killed in drought years because of that. But yeah, quality-wise, it can be quite good. If it's cut early and it's good quality like that, sheep will eat it up, no dramas. If it goes to the other end of the extreme and it's just stalky, then they'll leave lots behind. But cattle will too, to a point, unless you push them hard enough.